Look at that. Look at that. If that fish was fat at all, it'd be a 10-pounder. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We are in the month of March, and this is, like I said in my Pick 4 video, my single favorite month of the year for bass fishing. I love this time of the year. You know, I love that the spring is on the way. It's well underway at this point, or definitely getting started, just depending on what part of the country you're in. But I love pre-spawn bass fishing. I love following those fish on their migration from, you know, where they were in the winter time to where they're gonna be in just like a month or so from now, where they'll actually be up there starting to spawn, you know, getting into that process. So this is a time of the year I feel like I've got a pretty good understanding as to what those fish do for the most part, and certainly a time of the year that's been good to me over the course of my career. I look at a lot of my, you know, my biggest wins, and a lot of those have happened during this time frame, the month of March specifically. But you know, just when the fish are in that pre-spawn type staging period, you know, that's a time of the year when I really enjoy fishing for them, and enjoy the way that I get to catch them. That's probably a big part of it, because I could tie on a lot of different hard baits this time of the year: crankbaits, jerk baits, lipless baits, and be able to go out there and cover water. You don't typically have to fish too slow this time of the year to be able to catch them. The technique, this is the technique of the month video, and the technique that I want to go over really isn't about a specific bait so much so as it is a way of fishing. And you know, it's something that is covered a lot, I feel like, once we get later into the summer, or into the summer when those fish are post-spawn. A lot of people fish offshore then. And people will fish offshore in the wintertime. They'll fish offshore, you know, super early in the spring when those fish are still pretty deep, whether that's fishing vertically, fishing out on long points, fishing in ditches and drains and that type of stuff. But I think a lot of people miss a little window of time, and this is a big money winning technique for me in this time of the year. So, but fishing offshore, but shallow water, that's something that I enjoy doing a lot, because I have found some unbelievable schools of bass this way. I have just caught, you know, size of fish on certain, you know, certain situations this way, you know, trying to catch, you know, big fish or numbers of big fish. This is a way that I'm able to do that. And the great part with this is a lot of times you find fish that are untapped, fish that other people aren't fishing for. So that's why this is kind of a hard technique for me, or to, you know, to want to share too much. But I know that it is a way that you can be really, really successful. So I think a lot of what people do early in the year, you know, they're following those fish out of that migration, and we read so much about a lot of different lakes and people pre-spawn targeting fish on channel swing type banks. You know, where that's a bluff, or you fish a bluff in, you fish a flat, whatever it may be, but they're literally following the shoreline. They're using that, you know, kind of as their guide. You can catch fish that way. Sometimes you can catch a lot of really good fish that way. But what I like to do is I like to get on places that are out away from the bank, stuff that's not connected to anything visible I can see. Whether I'm just using my Lake Master mapping, my Humminbird 360, you know, if I'm picking up any clues of stuff that's coming out off the bank. But really, I'm fishing this much like I will once those fish are post-spawn, and I'm then looking strictly at my mapping and looking for those places that are out offshore, you know, a little break or a high spot, a drop, whatever that may be. That's exactly what I'm doing this time of the year, but I'm just doing it in a lot shallower water. Now, I understand you go to a Highland Reservoir, there's not going to be a whole lot of this, you know, to be able to fish. I think of a Table Rock Lake comes to mind. Other than a few zones, once you get way up those rivers and stuff, there's just not tons of shallow offshore structure. It's just not a lot of it. So this doesn't really apply to every single lake across the country. But you go to a Tennessee River lake like Pickwick, or a Coosa River lake, you know, those type of places where you have a lot of shallow offshore structure. That's where this is really going to come into play, and you're going to be able to maximize this technique. So those type of places, just like what you're looking for in the summertime, most of the time, a lot of these places are going to be, you know, lakes and systems that have current in them. And depending on the water temperature is really going to help you determine just where those fish are going to set up. If that water's into the 50s, you're talking 52, 55, 57 degree range, those fish are feeding. I mean, those fish are, you know, they want to be eaten up and getting ready for that spawn and definitely be fattening up. So places where that current is hitting, maybe not the very hardest place where it would hit and those fish will set up in the summertime, but places that are definitely catching that current are going to be the kind of places you want to fish this time of the year with a couple of these techniques or the couple of these baits that I'm going to share here in just a minute. But look at it that way. Look at it from how that current is flowing, where it's running into a bar, where it's running into a point, how it's going across a hump, anything like that. Those places where that current is hitting is definitely what you want to look at. And much like it is later in the year, you're looking for any type of cover out there. You know, if that's some chunk rock, if that's a couple stumps, maybe a little brush pile or something, it does seem like anywhere that you've got a little bit more significant cover is really a big deal pre-spawn, probably even more so than it is post-spawn in my opinion. That time of the year, it's truly almost exclusively about the cover. Pre-spawn, I think those fish really still like to have something to relate to, you know, some chunk rock or a piece of wood, whatever that may be. As far as getting out there and finding some of these areas, a big thing for me then is side imaging. I'll out a lot of the lake and use my Humminbird side imaging, and I'm going to get out there and just scan around those areas, and I'm looking for stuff primarily less than 10 feet deep. A lot of times it's actually going to be even shallower than that. You know, in that 3 to 5 foot range is probably my favorite depth to be able to try to find a lot of places that are, you know, that shallow offshore type stuff. That's going to vary based on the water color a little bit. You know, if that water's got 3 or 4 feet of visibility, those fish probably aren't going to be quite that shallow. They're going to be out in more of that 7 to, you know, 10 or maybe even 12 foot depth range. But if that water's got, you know, pretty good color in it, foot and a half, 2 foot of visibility, I'm going to be looking a lot in that 3 to 7 foot range as far as where I expect those fish to be. So yeah, again, just looking at the watercolor is going to help you tell just how deep that you should be fishing. But yes, get out there, side image, look at that lake master mapping, and then just start graphing around, because a lot of these places, like I said, they're not going to be the most obvious places where the current is hitting necessarily. It may be just a little subtle inside turn or something like that. And I have found some really big schools of fish where I actually saw the fish on my side imaging up on this type of deal. But most of the time, this is a deal where you're going to, you know, catch a couple of fish off of a spot, or you may catch one, you may come back later and catch another one. This isn't the type of deal where post-spawn you're going to pull up and catch, you know, 15 or 20 fish back to back to back. That's generally not what you're looking for. It's really good. That's the way it is, but that's not every single day. What you're looking for is a little, you know, a little turn, a little piece of cover, something like that, where it's something a little bit different. You're going to drop a waypoint, and then you're going to come back and fish through that area. That's a big part of why 360 honestly is so important for me with this technique, because it may be a very subtle something. I may have 3 or 4 little spots that I find on side imaging out through here. So I'm going to hit each one of these, but I'm able to fish my way between them. And while I'm doing that with 360, I may pick up something different, or just when I get up to that waypoint, I'm able to pick it out specifically and make a targeted cast to it. So that's a big, big player for me on this shallow offshore structure fishing type game. A couple of baits, you know, really for me, I keep it pretty simple on this deal. It's going to be a moving bait to start with always. I will, if I found a place that I just know fish are using, maybe I've caught fish there a couple different times during the day, and I go back to it another time, I may fish something slower, a shaky head or something like that. But for me, 2 baits that really start off with a crankbait and a lipless crankbait. You know, that OG Slim being a flat-sided bait works exceptionally well during the month of March in those 50-degree water temperatures. For me, that's what when I think March, I'm thinking waters between 50 and 60, and that is an excellent bait in that water temperature range. Runs 6 feet deep, you know, so it's kind of covering all the bases. It's going to fish most all that water that I need to fish. If it's a little bit deeper than that, I may drop to that DT8, which is a new bait for us. An excellent bait in that water temperature range. But yeah, a regular crankbait is a good one. Man, I have to say, a lipless crankbait is so very effective in that cooler water temperature. This is the Color Classic crawl, this is the one that I sharpied up. This isn't the exact bait, but this is the color that I was making that Arashi Vibe in the Classic, you know, to be able to basically be what this is. But that was a dynamite bait for fishing those type of places, especially a lot of that stuff that you're fishing in the spring isn't a real sharp break. A lot of that stuff, I'd be sitting in 5.5 or 6 feet deep, throwing to 2 feet of water. So it's a pretty subtle break, and that, you know, lipless crankbait, you're able to fish those flats really effectively with that bait. So that's something that you know, probably my favorite time of the year to fish a lipless crankbait is March. If I had to pick one month of the year, just given where those fish are and a lot of those flats and really subtle breaks, that's when that Arashi Vibe seems to really shine. But yeah, those shallow offshore places, it will surprise you, you know, just how little it takes to hold those fish. And I've mentioned some stuff about, you know, stuff being out on the main lake. Another great place to find fish, grouped up big time, and some of the biggest schools of fish I've ever found that time of the year are on some of our highland reservoirs and lakes that have really well-defined creek channels. You get back into those creek channels and you're following that creek channel along, and anywhere where there's an intersection, you know, there's another creek channel that joins it, or there's a little high spot with a patch of gravel. Any kind of little subtle differences like that can be places where those fish really stack up. So for me, I'm looking for one of those two. It's typically main lake, more point, you know, hump, something like that oriented, or getting back in those flats, following a creek channel and looking for intersections along those two. Those are the kind of places that definitely seem to pay dividends. For one final thing, just to, you know, to cover, I've covered those baits a little bit, and the rod and reel setup that I like to fish, both of those on is a Bass Pro cranking stick. This is a 7-foot medium heavy action. That's my go-to for any of that shallow water type cranking stuff. And for either of these techniques, I'm typically going to start with 14-pound XPS fluorocarbon line. I'll always fish fluorocarbon line on these setups. If I'm wanting a little more depth out of them, I would drop down to 12. If I'm wanting to keep those baits up a little shallower, I would raise that up to 17. But that 14 is kind of my go-to all-around line for those. And that Johnny Morse Platinum reel, you probably got sick of me talking about that one, but that 6:8 to 1 gear ratio for all my crankbait fishing, that is my go-to speed. I know how that reel handles those baits. I know what kind of speed it's doing when I'm out there fishing with it. So that is my setup for any of those shallow water crankbait fishing. But it's a technique that I love to do. You know, I think it's something that is a great way to get away from the crowds in March. That's typically the time of year a lot of people start showing up on our lakes. It's a great time of year to be out there. The fish are generally starting to move and starting to feed pretty good. But if you can find those little subtle offshore places, get away from beating the bank, it can really pay dividends this time of year.